Okay, g'day and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar on understanding electronic flight bags. This webinar is part of our AvSafety webinar series for flight planning. My name's Shaun Holmes. I'm one of the Aviation Safety Advisors and I'm based with CASA's Sydney office. Now, before we get started and get into today's presentation, just a couple of housekeeping items. The first one being that you will notice that your cameras and your microphones have been switched off. We will have some time at the end of today's presentation, about 10 minutes or so, for a bit of Q&A for any questions that you have. If there's any questions that I'm unable to answer, then I will make sure that we can get an answer provided to you after the presentation through the email address that you've registered with. So to submit a question, up on the top Teams bar, you'll notice you have a small chat bubble. You can open up the meeting chat, type your question in. I will try and keep an eye on any of your questions as we work through the seminar, and if I can, I'll answer them there. Otherwise, as I mentioned, we'll have that time at the end of today's presentation to answer any questions that you have. Now, as with previous webinars, this webinar will be recorded and it will be available on the CASA website, linking to the Pilot Safety Hub in the flight planning section and also on the CASA YouTube channel as well, CASA Briefing. So, before we start talking about the presentation, we have partnered with Credly with our AvSafety webinars. So you will receive a digital badge from Credly to recognise your commitment to continuous learning. Okay. All you need to do is just stay for the duration of the webinar, and look, that can be in any capacity with the microphones and cameras off. If you're relaxing, having lunch, whatever that may be, fantastic. So what we'll be discussing today, a few main points which we'll work our way through. We'll start with an introduction and we'll talk about the main uses and functionalities of EFB or electronic flight bags from a regulatory perspective. We won't be diving into and getting into any of the specific functionalities or capabilities of any of the main software application providers, but a good opportunity to look at more broadly what can an EFB do and how should we be using it safely and effectively. So to go with that, we'll look at the hardware and software, whether it's a portable item or something different, and what kinds of software we can use just to get a base of understanding on what we can take in the aircraft with us or have in the aircraft that's fitted. We'll look at the regulatory requirements in terms of usage, mounting systems, and any considerations there. We have a couple of ATSB occurrence briefs which give us the opportunity to look at why we have some of those regulatory requirements in place. And now when we discuss those ATSB occurrence briefs, it's so that we can extract the safety elements from there rather than looking to appoint blame to any of the pilots involved. And then we can talk about a little bit of practical and actually using the EFB. And if we're going to go and use the EFB, which is an absolutely fantastic tool, which we're going to talk about in a minute, what are some basic, relatively straightforward items and limitations that we need to consider in the process of using that EFB? So that could be that you're looking at using EFB for the first time, or I imagine for a lot of you, it's the matter of you're already using an EFB and there might be some helpful tips and tricks in there as well. So what is an electronic flight bag? Well, an electronic flight bag is an information system which allows you as the pilot to store, update, you can deliver, display, and compute digital data which supports flying operations and your flying duties. Okay, so really what it does is, in being such a fantastic tool, it replaces those traditional paper products that we sometimes have to wrestle with in the aircraft. And they can also store and display the kinds of data that's relevant to aircraft operations, like performance calculations or weight and balance calculations, okay? In more recent years, EFBs also now have additional functionalities around presenting traffic information and also ATSB type information in certain circumstances, which is also, fantastic and beneficial to improving situational awareness. So there's no doubt that they're an absolutely fantastic tool. And, in our discussions today, I take nothing away from, how they have transformed flight operations and make life so much easier for us. Okay, so we'll start working our way through some of the elements or components of using an EFB. The first thing being the hardware components. What does the actual piece of equipment look like? For most of us, the most common piece of equipment that we're going to use is a portable EFB. So that's your iPad, your tablet, that kind of portable device, which is essentially a personal device, and it's not part of the aircraft configuration. Okay, that would be the most common, as I mentioned. The other ability that you can have with the aircraft is it may be that it's a device which is installed and integrated into the aircraft itself, which when it is installed and integrated into the aircraft, you also then will have airworthiness requirements for that equipment as well, which is a little less common. As I mentioned, we're probably more used to that portable style EFB iPad tablet. Okay, once we have our hardware, we've got an iPad tablet, that sort of thing to use, then we will have software applications that we would consider using to provide some of those benefits that I discussed around that flight documentation, that sort of thing. So from a software perspective, we have a couple of different types. Type A applications display information that is not critical to the safety of the flight. So things like a certificate of airworthiness, a passenger or a cargo manifest, okay, provided in an electronic format. Which follows on that a type B application is going to display essential documents required to be carried by the regulations. So we're talking about your aeronautical information, so your maps, charts, aerodrome information, your weather and NOTAMs, that sort of thing are displayed by type B applications. And if you're using a software application to display instrument approach charts, then that particular software application does need to be approved by CASA as well, which when we're looking at some of the common providers, it's likely that they are approved by CASA to be able to display that information as well. So from a regulatory perspective, if I'm a private pilot or a license holder and I'm looking to conduct a Part 91 private operation and I'd like to use an EFB during the flight, what do I need to do? Well, there's no specific authorization requirement prior to using an EFB for a Part 91 private operation, okay? Part 91 does specify a couple of requirements in this space. So Part 91 requires that you must consider using the EFB, ensuring that it does not create a hazard. So really what that's coming down to is asking yourself that question of what if? What if the EFB fails? How will I meet my requirements for aeronautical information or being able to meet the navigation requirements or the fuel monitoring requirements as well. So we need to consider those what ifs. If the EFB fails, how will I ensure that does not create a hazard? And we also need to consider the portable electronic device requirements as well. What are we talking about there? Well, the pilot in command needs to ensure that if you allow a person on the aircraft to use a portable electronic device, you need to ensure it won't affect the safety of the aircraft. Not specifically relevant to you using an EFB, but the other part of portable electronic devices is that as the pilot of the aircraft, you need to ensure that if you are using a portable electronic device, that it does not distract you from performing your duties for the flight. So reasonably straightforward in that respect, and not requiring a specific authorization from CASA to do so to start using that EFB. Now, for AOC, Australian AOC holders, generally speaking, an Australian AOC holder is required to be approved by CASA prior to first use of an EFB. For certificate holders, there are other requirements. CASA does not generally require a specific approval. So if we're talking about 138, 141, 142 type certificate holder, generally we don't require specific approval unless, for example, there's a trigger of a significant change process, but you are required to have certain exposition or operations manual content. So for AOC and certificate holders, I would strongly recommend having a look in our AC on electronic flight bags. I'd also recommend for private pilots to have a read, but for those sort of more specific requirements for AOC and certificate holders, have a read of Chapter 4 of the AC. That will let you know what you're required to have. And also in the AC, we have a lot of information and guidance on building that kind of material for your ops manual or exposition, and also a self-assessment and implementation checklist. So there's some good information there as well from an operator perspective. Okay, that's a great time. Now that we have just discussed when can I and how do I go about using my EFB, once we're going to use the EFB, what regulatory requirements must we meet when we're actually using it? So the first one I want to talk about is meeting your navigation requirements for a VFR flight. So unfortunately, the EFB that has GPS capability cannot be used as a primary means of navigation. It doesn't meet the requirements for navigation equipment that's detailed in the Part 91 Manual of Standards in Chapter 26. So what does that mean? It means that you still will need to, if you're using an EFB with a chart is displayed like the diagram there, you must still meet your VFR flight navigation requirements. So what does that mean? You still need to, when navigating by visual reference to the ground or water, have your positive position fix not more than 30 minutes apart, using features marked on the topographical chart, okay? So how you do that, that could be making a point or a notation on that electronic chart that that's a position fix and that's the time that you were there. That's one way or one method that you could do it, okay? But the big thing there is the EFB is not that approved GPS system that meets those requirements. Okay. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, what about if I wanted to use my EFB for went balance or performance calculation? So again, I will split this for a Part 91 private operation. as the pilot in command, you are responsible, if using the EFB, for ensuring that the data or the information that the EFB produces matches the approved data for the aircraft. So how do you go about doing that? Well, you're going to need to do some comparison, okay? You're going to need to do some cross-referenced calculations to ensure that the information that the EFB is producing is in line and matches the approved data. Okay. Now, for air transport operators and some certificate holders, in particular 138, there are additional requirements prior to using the EFB for such things like weight and balance. Again, I would recommend having a look in the AC 91-17 to have a look at some of those requirements. Typically, we're talking about involvement of a weight control authority and some assessment and approval processes there. So a little bit of information for operators. As I mentioned, for private pilots, it's about ensuring that that information is correct and in line with that approved data. Okay, getting into the aircraft and using the EFB and thinking about how will I mount and potentially use, will it be handheld, will it be mounted, as I mentioned. Really the most popular kinds of mounting we're talking about is things like suction, Velcro, clamp mounts that might mount to a dash line. So all of these temporary mounting systems, or just having the EFB handheld, is regarded as being an unsecured device. So that device needs to be secured during essentially critical phases of flight. So what are we talking about here? During takeoff and landing, during an instrument approach, the aircraft is flying at a height less than 1,000 feet above terrain, and in turbulent conditions. So that's something to definitely consider if you're going to use an EFB and you need access to that aeronautical information during those times. It may not be appropriate to be using a temporary mount or a handheld EFB in that situation because it needs to be stowed away safely. So, what is acceptable to CASA so that you could potentially use that EFB throughout the entire flight? Well, you can have a permanent mounting system. Permanent mounting requires an airworthiness approval. Permanent mounting, we're talking about making a modification to the aircraft. Yes, if you were to, say, screw a mount into the aircraft structure or the dash or something like that, that is a modification. So permanent mounting does require airworthiness approval. And this is a good opportunity for us to talk about control yoke or control column mounting of a device as well. We need to be careful and cautious with that kind of mounting because it's difficult to understand the weight of the EFB and the mounting bracket and everything. It's difficult to understand the effect that that could have on flight control system dynamics, even though it's relatively light. So again, it's something that we're looking for an approval to have a permanent mount or to have a mount like that. Now, when you are mounting, it's important to consider if you are attaching any power cords or antenna cables or anything like that to your EFB. And also consider the mount itself. It should not obstruct your vision excessively. It should not cause any issues with access to any of the controls of the aircraft. It generally should not present a safety risk or a physical hazard in terms of getting in and out of the aircraft, particularly in an emergency situation, an emergency egress. We don't want to be getting tangled up in that cabling or potentially having difficulties with the mounting system. So that's something to consider when you do mount your EFB. So we've covered, having access to the EFB for the entire flight. we can go down the permanent mount pathway and obtaining an airworthiness approval from CASA. The other more easier option, which I'm sure some of you are quite familiar with, is having it attached to a kneeboard. So an EFB attached to a kneeboard holder does not need to be stowed during those critical stages of flight. And it means if you want or need access to your EFB, then you've got it there on the kneeboard. Why? It's a different mounting mechanism rather than, say, suction or clamping, and you're also going to have an increased awareness of the security of the device because it's attached to your person. Neil, who can provide an airworthiness approval, the best thing to do would be to speak to your local maintenance organisation. They would be looking to obtain an approval for you under subpart 21M of the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations, which deals with modifications of aircraft. And we also recommend a minimum screen size. The minimum recommended screen size is 200 millimeters measured diagonally. So as an idea, an iPad mini is an indication of that 200 millimeters. Can you use a mobile phone? Well, yes, you can, but there are going to be situations where it's going to be difficult to read and get that information from. So we recommend a certain size. Okay. We have a couple of occurrence briefs here to discuss. I can see a couple of questions coming in. I will probably just keep going for now and we'll get to those in a moment. So these are quite recent occurrence notifications. You can see on the left-hand side there with the R44, October last year, and with the air tractor again, October 2024. So a brief description of the R44 incident. This was a private flight. The pilot's phone, which the pilot was using for navigation, was secured in a commercial mount attached to the interior of the helicopter. During the flight, the phone became dislodged from the mount and fell to the floor near the pilot's feet. In obvious concern that the loose phone would interfere with the flight controls, the pilot elected to conduct a precautionary landing so that it could be retrieved and resecured. So you can see it gives a bit of background to why we have some of those requirements around mounting and the types of mounting that's being used. The flight was being undertaken in the Thredbo area, so the pilot selected to land at a nearby landing site with an elevation of 6,300 feet. There was insufficient power to arrest the descent rate on the approach to landing. The aircraft performed a run-on landing, during which the skid caught a tussock of grass. The helicopter turned 180 degrees and tipped on its side. The tail rotor contacted the ground and the boom broke and separated the tail section from the fuselage. So the helicopter was substantially damaged and the pilot and passengers evacuated without injuries. So we can see, stemming from a relatively basic concern, if you like, of that phone or that EFB coming from the mount, being concerned about it being near the flight controls. There was an unfortunate outcome from that incident. Now, continuing that discussion about those loose items in the cockpit, the air tractor occurrence notification is not specific to an EFB, but also a good reminder about those loose items in the cockpit and the potential safety aspects there as well. So the air tractor was on approach to land at a private landing area in Queensland. A water bottle fell onto the floor in the cockpit and rolled in front of the co-pilot's left rudder pedal. The pilot decided to abort the landing and climb to a safe altitude to try and retrieve the bottle before attempting another approach. During the climb, the aircraft, and after retracting the flaps, the aircraft suddenly yawed sharply to the left. Okay. The pilot reported being unable to control the aircraft effectively and increased the my apologies, reduced the power to bring the aircraft back to a more level state. Being unable to climb, the pilot chose to attempt a landing, however collided with trees short of an open field. The impact with the trees caused the aircraft to veer left and overturn, and coming to rest upside down, the pilot sustained minor injuries and was able to exit, and a fire consumed the aircraft following the impact. So again, it's just showing some of those safety elements of having those loose items in the aircraft and potentially causing safety concerns, which, as I mentioned, is why we have that information there about mounting and making sure that we're just safely using that EFB while it's in the aircraft, because they can be quite large, bulky items that, you know, are suction cupped to a window, which generally work really well. But as we know with suction cups, when they stop working completely. Okay, moving on to some practical aspects and using an EFB. Okay, because they're such a fantastic and wonderful tool and complete a lot of tasks for us in a short space of time, present a large amount of information to us, and they take away some of those more tedious tasks as well, particularly when we're flight planning. Sometimes that can turn into fixation, over-reliance when we're in the aircraft. You know, perhaps if we haven't spent the time on the ground planning and looking through our EFB, that can turn into fixation and distraction when we're in the aircraft using the EFB. So good way to use the EFB is to exercise discipline and use EFBs correctly. Be very careful of that complacency, because it is so easy to, you know, create a significant amount of information 5-10 minutes before you fly and not allocate that time that's necessary to developing that situational awareness. So really the time to be staring at and really digging into your EFB is on the ground, to look through that important information and to improve your situational awareness. I mentioned earlier that EFBs are also now able to display traffic data and ATSB traffic data, and can connect or be connected to some ATSB devices, which are a fantastic tool which can aid situational awareness, particularly in those non-controlled environments. It's important to remember that they do not replace your responsibility to see and avoid other aircraft, and the lookout is still critical and very important, but that EFB can help with that information and building that picture. Now, we have at the moment the government at the moment has a ATSB device rebate scheme. So I'm just going to pop some details into the chat now if you're interested on further information about ATSB and what kind of devices you might be able to purchase through the rebate scheme. And that will allow you to then look further into, you know, what the capabilities are in terms of connecting it to your EFB. So there's some good information there. Okay, heat is always a concern with the EFB, and I'm sure most of us have experienced a device which has given up in very hot conditions. So what can we do? Manage cockpit airflow. Okay, try and have some airflow on the EFB if that's possible, especially on very hot days. Try and keep the EFB out of direct sunlight, which can help as well. Managing your brightness settings can also have a very significant effect. Having it as low as possible so that it's still readable and usable can reduce some of the heat that's produced. And if you're not using it, definitely stow it away or store it somewhere cooler, or take it with you rather than leaving it in the aircraft in the hot sun, for example. So that will help you reduce, you know, the possibility that the EFB may fall over due to heat issues. And this relates to power and charging a little bit as well. So we need to consider a couple of things here. It's important to consider having enough charge prior to the flight that you're going to undertake. and determining, well, how long is the flight, how much charge might I need, keeping in mind that if you do have the ability to charge an EFB during the flight in the aircraft, generally speaking, the rate that an aircraft can charge the EFB is not sufficient to maintain the charge. It may just reduce the rate of discharge or hold you relatively consistently. That's something that you may have to sort of look at and work out in using your EFB. So just keep that in mind. And managing your screen brightness can also have a significant effect on your battery usage as well. So just some nice basic tips there. In terms of connection, okay? Yes, EFBs may need connection to the internet for certain data, so it's important to be extremely mindful of what data does require a connection. For the most part, software applications, you are able to download the information and it's all available to you when you get into the aircraft to use it. So the big thing there is just making sure that the data is downloaded and is going to be available. There'd be nothing worse than needing some aeronautical information and it's not downloaded, or you don't have the, the internet or the mobile phone reception if your device has that functionality to view that data. So that's an important thing to consider as well. And it's also important to consider, as we touched on a little bit earlier, the accuracy of the device. I think personally that they can generally be quite accurate, although sometimes not. There can be a lag in the indication of your position if you're using an aircraft function. The big thing is that a lot of EFBs don't indicate if there's a loss of signal or a failure, and they don't verify the integrity of the information being displayed. So it can be sometimes difficult to understand how accurate that data is when we're looking at the EFB and as I said, the aircraft representation that's on the screen. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, incorrect data, as I mentioned, EFB produces a massive amount of information that we can then look through, particularly during our pre-flight stages, when we're creating a flight plan, a fuel log, that sort of thing. If we have that capability, it's important to just ask ourselves, does the data make sense? Is it correct? Okay, a gross error check. We spoke a little bit about going a bit beyond that with some of the weight and balance and performance information. Make sure the data makes sense. As we discussed in the beginning of today's session, if the device fails, you need to ensure that it's not going to create a hazard to the operation of the aircraft. So how can you prevent that from occurring? Having a backup option, okay? We don't specify prescriptively that you must have charts or you must have another EFB or you must have hard copy aeronautical information. So having a backup item is going to be important so that if the EFB fails, it does not create a hazard. How you cover that, you can make that decision on. If you'd like to have physical documents with you, that's fantastic. Or if you'd like to generally carry physical documents with you all the time, great. If you wanted to use another EFB to back up your main EFB, that's also a good option too, but have that backup option so that if your EFB does fail, you've got something else to rely on. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is in terms of emergencies, because we're talking about devices that have a lithium-ion battery within them. So we do need to think about the what ifs, as I mentioned. What will I do if this device fails and starts to produce smoke or catches on fire? Okay, the likelihood is relatively low, but it is a consideration that we need to think about when we're using an EFB. So the best way to control that situation and stop a lithium battery thermal runaway is to cool it down. Now, basic recommendations can be submerging the device in water. I understand that's going to be quite difficult to do when you're in the aircraft. So quite a handy way, and it's a method that we recommend in the AC, is looking at things like a lithium safe battery bag to contain. It may not actually stop the thermal runaway, but it may give you the ability to contain that device so that you can get yourself onto the ground and get that device under control. So it'd be worthwhile having a look into those lithium safe battery bags and considering those what ifs. What happens if my EFB device does really fail and have some serious issues? Okay, that covers the main body of the presentation today. I have seen some questions coming through, which I will have a look at now, and we'll see if we can get some answers for you. Barry, when is CASA going to upgrade the training curriculum and regs using EFBs? Yes, that's fantastic feedback. And look, I'm happy to pass that on to our standards teams to consider. I don't have an immediate answer for you at the moment. When you look at Schedule 2 of the Part 61 Manual of Standards, it does make indications of using a chart and using a specific protractor like an E6B, that sort of thing. But that is good feedback that I can pass on at least to the standards team at the moment. And if we can give you some additional information there after the webinar, we definitely will. David, what about having the EFB in the folder with your maps, which can be on your lap? Again, in terms of loose items in the cockpit, we're talking about stowage of the EFB. We really should be stowing those loose items during those critical stages of flight mentioned as well. So even if you are using things like charts, say a folder with maps that's on your lap, that sort of thing, I would strongly recommend having that and those items stowed as well during those critical stages. So yes, you could put it into that folder, but I would be stowing that folder and just removing some of those loose items. Alan, what is the difference between a clamp and what is it, and a mount on the control column? From a clamping perspective, you can have mounts that clamp, and excuse my very basic explanation, but we're talking about a mount that can clamp to an object and then would have some other armature and the EFB would attach to that. And a mount on the control column, that's generally how mounts are attached to a control column with a clamping style mount so that the EFB sits on top of the control column facing at the pilot. Paul, did I understand you to say that a kneeboard mounted EFB requires pre-approval before use? No, it does not. A kneeboard mounted EFB does not require approval. Chris answered that, thank you. Niels, I hope I've got that right. I'm unable to answer that at the moment, but if we can get some information back to you, then we'll definitely get some information back to you in that space, because I do understand that yes, and an engineering order, if you like, is a costly exercise. As I mentioned, the other alternative is looking at that. If you're comfortable, the other alternative is looking at the kneeboard mount, which is an approved mounting system as well. Brent, again, great question. I would have to get some additional details, and if, again, we can provide some information there, we'll look at providing that information as well. Andrew, is a mobile phone an acceptable backup device for a Part 91 private operation? Yes. The requirements on screen size are still in place. No longer specific screen size requirements. It's a recommendation that it's 200 millimeters diagonally. So if you feel that using a mobile device as a backup is not going to create any additional hazard if your main EFB fails, then that's definitely a suitable option if you'd like to use that. Don, if you go to the CASA website, you can provide us feedback on safety concerns in the contact us section. So you're able to put those details of those concerns there into that website section. That would be the best place to go. And I'm hoping maybe Courtney, you might be able to pop a link in the chat for that one as well. Regulatory policy on EFB database 008 update compliance. At this stage, the requirement is that you're using up-to-date aeronautical information. So if you need to have your EFB database updated or your iOS information updated to ensure that those maps and charts, for example, are the latest current versions, then you will have to do that. But from the regulatory perspective, it's not specific to the database or update compliance. Okay, I can see some info there about connecting to EC devices. David, I believe there is some work going on in that space. If we're able to provide any information, then again, we'll definitely make sure that we can provide that to you, but not at the moment. Cameron, is there explosive depressurization testing required for EFBs in a pressurized 121 aircraft? I do not know that actually. So we'll have to have a look and see if there are any requirements there in relation to the 121 aircraft. There are any regulations, cautions regarding recharge packs? It would be the same considerations as the actual EFB. So you have a lithium battery device. There would be the same cautions regarding the use of a recharge pack. For example, Tony, I imagine you're referring to using a recharge pack to charge your EFB. Yes, okay, perfect. Yeah, so again, the lithium battery being a dangerous good, there's still going to be those considerations around the item. There are limitations around the size and output of recharge packs, although I don't have that information directly on me. It may be worth having a quick search on the allowable output limits for a recharge pack, but certainly in the smaller end and smaller scale, they can be used. Okay, I can't see any other questions coming in there. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. Really appreciate you spending the time to drop in. I hope that you had something there, a tip or trick or something to take away from today's session. As I mentioned, the recording will be available on the Pilot Safety Hub and on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And I hope you join us again for our next webinar Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone. Cheers.